Mr. Daniels was the kind of teacher every student loved. He wasn't just someone who stood in front of a blackboard and gave lectures. He made learning exciting. He believed that education was more than just books and tests. It was about teaching students how to think, how to stand up for what was right, and how to believe in themselves. He had been teaching at Jefferson High School for over 10 years. In that time, he had helped countless students who felt lost, unmotivated, or misunderstood. Some students came from tough backgrounds, dealing with problems at home or in the community. But when they stepped into Mr. Daniels' classroom, they felt safe. They knew he cared. He had a way of listening, of making people feel seen. He taught history, but he did it differently. Instead of just reading from a textbook, he made his students debate real-world issues. He asked them questions that made them think. What would you have done if you lived in the past? Or how can we learn from history to make the future better? His classes were filled with energy, discussion, and sometimes even laughter. One student, Jake, had struggled with school for years. He had almost dropped out, thinking he wasn't smart enough. But Mr. Daniels wouldn't let that happen. He spent extra time helping Jake after school, encouraging him, telling him that he had potential. Slowly, Jake started believing in himself. By the end of the year, he was one of the top students in the class. Then there was Maria, who used to sit in the back of the room, too shy to speak. Mr. Daniels noticed her talent for writing and encouraged her to share her thoughts. Soon, she started participating in class, and by senior year, she was winning writing competitions. Mr. Daniels believed in his students, and they believed in him. Parents respected him too. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a mentor, a role model, and a guide. One thing he always told his students was, never let anyone tell you that you don't matter. Your voice is important. Stand up for what's right. That's why, on the morning of what seemed like an ordinary Wednesday, no one expected what was about to happen. Mr. Daniels walked into his classroom as usual, smiling as he greeted his students. The walls were decorated with student projects, posters of historical figures, and motivational quotes. The room felt warm, welcoming, a place of learning, growth, and respect. As he was about to start the lesson, the door suddenly swung open. 2 police officers stepped inside. The room fell silent. Students exchanged confused glances. Mr. Daniels, surprised but calm, set down his book. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked politely. One of the officers, a tall man with a serious expression, looked directly at Mr. Daniels. "Step outside, sir. We need to talk." Mr. Daniels frowned. "Can we do this after class? I'm in the middle of a lesson." The officer shook his head. Now, a heavy feeling settled in the room. The students watched, their eyes wide with uncertainty. Why were the police here? Why did they want their teacher? Mr. Daniels hesitated for only a second. He didn't want to make a scene in front of his students, so he nodded and walked toward the door. But before he could step outside, the second officer grabbed his wrist. Gasps filled the room. The students couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Wait, what are you doing?" one student shouted. The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered. Mr. Daniels' heart pounded. "Is there a misunderstanding?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. But the officers didn't answer. Before he could say another word, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The entire class erupted. "What's going on? Why are you arresting him?" He didn't do anything. Some students jumped up from their seats. Others pulled out their phones and started recording. The confusion quickly turned into outrage. Mr. Daniels looked at his students, his face calm but his eyes filled with something they had never seen before: pain. As the officers led him out of the classroom, the voices of his students followed him down the hallway. "This isn't right. He didn't do anything wrong." The door swung shut behind him. Inside the classroom, the students sat in stunned silence. The classroom was silent after Mr. Daniels was taken away. No one knew what to do. Some students were still holding their phones, staring at the screens in shock. Others looked at each other, trying to understand what had just happened. Jake, sitting near the front, clenched his fists. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Why would they arrest him? He didn't do anything." Maria felt a lump in her throat. "Did you see how they treated him? They didn't even tell them why." A few students stood up and rushed to the window, hoping to see where the police had taken Mr. Daniels. Outside, in the school parking lot, they watched as he was placed inside a police car. The doors slammed shut, and within seconds, the car drove away. The entire room felt heavy. Mr. Daniels wasn't just any teacher. He was the kind of person who cared, who made a difference. Seeing him taken away like that, in front of their own eyes, felt wrong. At that moment, the classroom door opened again. This time, it was the principal, Mr. Collins. His face was serious, and he cleared his throat before speaking. "I need everyone to stay calm," he said. "I know you have questions, but I need you to continue with your studies. This matter is being handled." His words didn't help. "Handled?" A student in the back spoke up. "They just arrested our teacher for no reason. How is that okay?" Mr. Collins sighed. "We don't have all the information yet. I promise you, we are looking into it." The students didn't trust that answer. They could tell Mr. Collins was trying to avoid saying too much. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved. Usually, students would be eager to rush out, but today, they just sat there, lost in thought. Jake turned to Maria. "We can't just sit here. We have to do something." Maria nodded. "But what? How do we even start?" Jake looked around at the others. "We need to find out why this happened, and we need to make sure everyone knows." That afternoon, the school buzzed with rumors. Some students whispered that Mr. Daniels had committed a crime. Others argued that there was no way he had done anything wrong. The truth was, no one knew for sure. But one thing was certain: his students weren't going to forget what they had seen. By lunchtime, the news had spread. Students were talking about it in the hallways, at their lockers, and in the cafeteria. Many were angry. "They took the best teacher in this school," one student said. "We can't let them get away with this." Maria scrolled through her phone. Someone had already posted the video of Mr. Daniels' arrest. Within minutes, it was getting shared over and over again. Comments flooded in. Some were shocked, some were furious, and others demanded answers. Jake leaned over to look at her screen. "This is bigger than just our school," he said. "People need to see this." Maria nodded. "Then let's make sure they do." By the end of the day, the video had thousands of views. It wasn't just students at Jefferson High talking about it anymore. People from all over were watching. Parents started calling the school, demanding to know what had happened. Local reporters picked up the story. Something was happening. Jake and Maria didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Mr. Daniels sat in the cold chair of the police station, his hands still cuffed. The room was small, with only a table and 2 chairs. A bright light above him flickered slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, treated like a criminal. A few minutes later, the door opened. 2 officers walked in, one holding a file. The taller officer sat down across from Mr. Daniels, looking at him carefully. The other stood near the door with his arms crossed. "Do you know why you're here?" the officer asked. Mr. Daniels kept his voice steady. "No, I don't. No one has told me anything." The officer tapped the file. "You matched the description of a suspect involved in a robbery that happened 2 nights ago." Mr. Daniels frowned. "That's impossible. I was at home, and yesterday I was teaching all day." The officer didn't react. "The witness said the suspect looked like you." Mr. Daniels shook his head. "That's a mistake. You can check with the school. There are security cameras. My students saw me. I was in class." The officer leaned back, glancing at his partner. "We'll look into that, but for now, you'll stay here." Mr. Daniels sighed. Am I being charged with something? The officer didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and left the room. The other officer followed, shutting the door behind them. Mr. Daniels closed his eyes. He had taught his students about moments like this, about staying calm, about believing in the truth. But now, sitting in this room, he wondered if the truth would be enough. Back at the school, the students refused to let the day continue as if nothing had happened. By the time the final bell rang, a group of them had gathered outside near the parking lot. Jake, Maria, and several others stood together, their faces serious. We need to do something, Jake said. If we don't, they'll just pretend this never happened. Maria nodded. People are already talking about it online. We should make sure even more people see it. Several students agreed. They started sharing the video with local news stations and community leaders. Parents were getting involved too, asking the school for answers. The school principal, Mr. Collins, was under pressure, but he had no real answers to give. By the evening, something unexpected happened. The news had picked up the story. A reporter stood outside the police station, speaking into the camera. A well-respected teacher, Mr. Daniels, was arrested today in front of his students. But now, many are questioning why. His students claim he was in class during the time of the crime, and security footage may prove it. The community is demanding answers. People started paying attention. The police department, now under pressure, had to respond. They issued a short statement, saying they were investigating the matter, but refused to admit any mistake. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Mr. Daniels still sat in the small room, waiting. No one had come back to speak to him. Hours passed. His hands felt sore from the tight cuffs. Then, finally, the door opened again. This time, a different officer entered. He looked uncomfortable, holding a piece of paper. "We're letting you go," he said. "We reviewed the footage from the school. You weren't at the scene of the crime." Mr. Daniels exhaled, relief washing over him. But it was mixed with frustration. "So that's it. You arrest me without proof, humiliate me in front of my students, and now you just let me go." The officer didn't respond. He simply unlocked the cuffs and handed Mr. Daniels his belongings. As he stepped out of the station, he saw something he hadn't expected: a crowd. His students, their parents, and other members of the community stood outside, holding signs, demanding justice. When they saw him, they cheered, "Mr. Daniels, we knew you didn't do anything." Mr. Daniels felt his heart swell. They had stood up for him. They hadn't let him be forgotten. But as he looked at the flashing cameras and the determined faces around him, he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Mr. Daniels took a deep breath as he stepped out of the police station. The night air was cool, but his mind was still racing. The past few hours had felt like a bad dream. Being pulled out of his classroom, taken away in handcuffs, accused of something he didn't do. But as he looked ahead, he saw something he hadn't expected. A crowd had gathered outside. His students, their parents, and other members of the community stood with signs and their phones recording. Some signs read "Justice for Mr. Daniels," while others said, "We stand with our teacher." The moment he appeared, the crowd erupted in cheers. Jake and Maria pushed through the crowd and ran up to him. "Mr. Daniels, we knew you didn't do anything," Jake said, his face filled with relief. Maria nodded. "The whole town is talking about this. Everyone saw what happened. They can't just ignore it." Mr. Daniels smiled, touched by their support. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you all." A few reporters stepped forward, holding microphones. "Mr. Daniels, how do you feel about what happened today?" one of them asked. He looked at the cameras, then at his students. He wanted to be careful with his words. He didn't want anger to control them. "I feel disappointed," he said calmly. "Disappointed that I was treated this way in front of my students. Disappointed that I was arrested without proof. But I am also hopeful because I see so many people standing here tonight, demanding what is right." The crowd cheered again. Meanwhile, inside the police station, the officers who had arrested him watched the scene through the window. One of them, Officer Grant, clenched his jaw. "This is getting out of control," he muttered. "We didn't expect this much attention." His partner sighed. "Maybe because we arrested the wrong guy," he said quietly. The truth was, they hadn't really checked before taking action. They had received a report, looked at a description, and made an assumption. Now the whole town was watching, and people were asking questions. At the school, the students refused to let things go back to normal. The next morning, when Mr. Daniels walked into the building, he was met with applause from students and teachers alike. "Welcome back, Mr. Daniels," someone shouted. He smiled, but he also knew this wasn't over. During lunch, Jake, Maria, and a few other students approached him. "We've been thinking," Jake started. "It's not enough that they let you go. They need to take responsibility for what they did." Mr. Daniels studied his students. Their eyes were filled with determination. He had spent years teaching them to stand up for what was right, and now they were putting those lessons into action. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Maria pulled out her phone. "We want to organize a peaceful protest. Nothing crazy, just something to show that what happened to you was wrong, and that this can't happen to anyone else." Mr. Daniels felt a sense of pride. His students were leading this fight, not with anger, but with reason, courage, and unity. By the afternoon, flyers were being handed out. Messages were spreading online. The protest was planned for the weekend in front of the police station, and people were listening. That night, the news covered the upcoming protest. Community leaders, teachers, and even parents announced their support. The police department, feeling the pressure, released another statement. This time, they said they would review the procedures that led to Mr. Daniels' wrongful arrest. But for many, that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about Mr. Daniels anymore. It was about fairness. It was about standing up for what was right. And the fight was just beginning. The weekend arrived, and the air was filled with anticipation. The protest was set to begin at noon, but by 11 a.m., people were already gathering outside the police station. Students, teachers, parents, and even members of the community stood together, holding signs and banners. "Justice for Mr. Daniels. Stop unfair arrests. We want change." Jake and Maria stood at the front, their eyes scanning the crowd. They had spent the last few days organizing this protest, and they couldn't believe how many people had shown up. "This is amazing," Maria said. "So many people care." Jake nodded. "We're not just fighting for Mr. Daniels. We're fighting for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly." Mr. Daniels arrived soon after, and the crowd erupted into cheers. He looked around, his heart swelling with emotion. He had always taught his students to stand up for what was right, but now they were the ones teaching him a lesson about courage and unity. As he stepped forward, a reporter approached him. "Mr. Daniels, how do you feel about today's protest?" He took a deep breath. "I feel grateful," he said. "This isn't just about me. This is about making sure something like this doesn't happen again, to anyone." The protest remained peaceful, just as they had planned. People held up their signs, chanted for justice, and listened to speeches from students, teachers, and community members. Parents shared stories of their own fears, worried that their children could be treated unfairly one day. Then something unexpected happened. A police officer stepped out of the station and approached the crowd. It was Officer Grant, the same officer who had arrested Mr. Daniels. The crowd fell silent as he took a deep breath and spoke. "I want to say something," he began. "We made a mistake." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some people folded their arms, skeptical of his words. Others waited to hear what he would say next. "When we arrested Mr. Daniels, we didn't have all the facts. We assumed something without checking properly. That was wrong." He paused before continuing. "I understand why you're angry. If I were in your place, I would be too. And I want you to know, we are listening." Mr. Daniels watched the officer carefully. He could see the discomfort on his face, but also something else: regret. The police chief soon stepped forward as well. "We are going to review how arrests are handled in this town. We don't want this to happen again. And most importantly, we are truly sorry for what happened to Mr. Daniels." The crowd listened, but they weren't ready to cheer just yet. Words were one thing. Action was another. Maria whispered to Jake, "Do you think they mean it?" Jake frowned. "I don't know. But if they don't, we'll make sure they do." The protest continued for hours, but something had changed. For the first time, the people in charge were admitting they were wrong. It was a small victory, but an important one. That evening, as the sun set, Mr. Daniels sat with his students at the school. "You all did something incredible today," he told them. "No matter what happens next, never stop standing up for what is right." Jake smiled. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Daniels." Maria nodded. "If we want change, we have to keep fighting for it." Mr. Daniels looked at them proudly. His students had become leaders, and as long as they continued to fight for what was right, he knew the future would be in good hands. The protest had ended, but the movement had just begun. Over the next few days, people in town kept talking about what had happened to Mr. Daniels. The video of his arrest had gone viral, and now more people outside the town were paying attention. News stations covered the story, social media was filled with posts, and even local leaders started speaking about it. At school, the students felt a new sense of purpose. They had seen the power of their voices, and they weren't going to stop now. During lunch, Jake, Maria, and a few others gathered in the library. "We need to make sure they keep their promise," Jake said, looking around at his friends. Maria nodded. "The police said they would change their ways, but how do we know they'll actually do it?" One of their classmates, Daniel, leaned forward. "What if we hold a town meeting? We invite the police chief, community leaders, and regular people. Let them speak, but also make them answer our questions." The group exchanged looks. It was a bold idea. "That's a great plan," Maria said. "If they know the whole town is watching, they'll have to take this seriously." Jake smiled. "Let's do it." That afternoon, the students went to the principal, Mr. Collins. At first, he seemed hesitant. "A town meeting? That's a big step," he said. "But an important one," Mr. Daniels added, standing beside his students. "They need to know we won't forget what happened." After thinking for a moment, Mr. Collins nodded. "All right, I'll help you organize it. We'll use the school gym, but remember, this has to be peaceful and respectful." The students agreed. Within a few days, word spread. Flyers were handed out, and messages were shared online. People from all over the town planned to attend. Even some news reporters confirmed they would be there. The police chief agreed to come, along with a few officers, including Officer Grant. The night of the meeting arrived. The school gym was packed with students, teachers, parents, and other members of the community. A stage was set up at the front, with chairs for the speakers. Jake and Maria sat in the front row, feeling nervous but excited. Mr. Daniels was seated nearby, giving them a reassuring nod. The meeting started with Mr. Daniels speaking. He shared his experience, explaining how he had been taken from his classroom, accused without proof, and held for hours. His voice was calm, but his words were powerful. "I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else," he said. "That's why we're here today, to make sure this doesn't get ignored." Next, the police chief took the microphone. "We understand the frustration," he said. "We made mistakes, and we are working on fixing them. We are reviewing our procedures to ensure arrests are based on solid evidence, not assumptions." A woman in the audience raised her hand. "What exactly are you changing?" she asked. The police chief hesitated for a moment, then answered, "We are requiring all officers to take additional training on fair procedures and handling situations carefully before making arrests." Some people in the audience murmured, "Was that enough?" Officer Grant then stood up. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I was one of the officers who arrested Mr. Daniels. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't check the facts properly. And for that, I truly apologize." The room was silent for a moment. Then Maria stood up. "Apologies are good, but actions are better," she said. "Will you work with us to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Officer Grant nodded. "Yes, we want to hear from you, the students, and the community. We don't want to be seen as people who harm. We want to serve and protect. But we know we have to earn back your trust." Jake looked at Maria. This was more than they had expected. The police weren't just talking, they were agreeing to work together. By the end of the meeting, people felt a mix of emotions. Some were still doubtful, but others were hopeful. As the students left the gym, Mr. Daniels placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You and Maria did something incredible today," he said. "You didn't just demand change, you started a conversation. That's how real progress begins." Jake smiled. "We're not done yet, Mr. Daniels. We'll make sure they keep their word." And with that, the fight for justice continued. The town meeting had ended, but the conversation had only just begun. Over the next few days, students, teachers, and community members kept discussing what had happened. Some believed the police were serious about making changes, while others were still unsure. Jake, Maria, and their friends knew they couldn't just trust words. They needed to see real action. At lunch, the group met again in the library. Maria placed her notebook on the table. "We need to follow up," she said. "The police promised training and changes in their system. We should check if they are actually doing it." Jake nodded. "And if they're not, we call them out." One of their friends, Daniel, had an idea. "What if we ask to attend one of their training sessions? That way, we can see for ourselves if they are taking this seriously." Maria's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea." Mr. Daniels, who had been listening, smiled. "You are thinking like real leaders," he said. "Change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from making sure promises are kept." The next day, Maria sent an email to the police chief requesting permission for a few students to observe the training sessions. They weren't sure if he would agree, but surprisingly, he responded quickly. "We welcome your participation," he wrote. "You can attend the first session this Saturday at the community center." Jake and Maria exchanged a look. "This is it," Jake said. "Now we see if they really mean what they say." When Saturday arrived, the students and Mr. Daniels walked into the community center. A few police officers were already there, along with an instructor from an outside organization. The session was about fair policing and handling situations without bias. Officer Grant was also present. He nodded at the students, then turned his attention to the instructor. The training was eye-opening. The instructor spoke about the importance of gathering all facts before making decisions, treating all people with respect, and ensuring fairness in every situation. The officers were asked difficult questions and had to think about real-life situations. At one point, the instructor asked, "Have any of you ever made a decision too quickly and later realized it was a mistake?" Officer Grant hesitated, then raised his hand. "I have," he said, "and it had consequences. It affected an innocent person's life. I don't want to repeat that mistake." Jake and Maria listened carefully. It wasn't easy for someone to admit their mistakes in front of others. At the end of the session, the instructor asked the students what they thought. Maria took a deep breath. "I think this is a good start," she said. "But training alone isn't enough. It has to be followed by real change in actions." Jake added, "We will be watching to make sure this doesn't stop here." The police chief nodded. "And we expect you to. Hold us accountable." As the students left, Mr. Daniels looked at them with pride. "You are making history," he said, "not by fighting with anger, but by leading with wisdom and courage." Jake smiled. "This isn't just about us, Mr. Daniels. It's about making sure no one else goes through what you did." Maria added, "And we won't stop until we see real change." As they walked home, they felt hopeful. There was still work to be done, but for the first time, it felt like the town was truly moving in the right direction. And they were ready to see it through to the end. Months had passed since Mr. Daniels' wrongful arrest, and the town had changed in many ways. The students, teachers, and community had worked together to ensure that promises were kept. The police training sessions continued, and more officers were learning about fair treatment, decision-making, and understanding different perspectives. The police department even created a new policy. Every arrest had to be backed by solid evidence, and all officers were required to double-check facts before taking action. It wasn't just words anymore. Real changes were happening. Jake, Maria, and their friends continued attending meetings with the police and community leaders. They kept asking tough questions, making sure nothing was forgotten. One day, the police chief invited them to a special meeting. "We want to show you the progress we've made," he said. When the students arrived at the police station, they were surprised. There was a new community advisory board, made up of students, teachers, and local leaders. This board would meet regularly with the police to discuss issues, share concerns, and suggest improvements. Maria smiled. "This is what we were fighting for," she whispered to Jake. During the meeting, Officer Grant spoke. "I want to say something," he said. "I've learned a lot from all of you. When I made that mistake, I didn't think much of it at the time. But now I understand how much harm it caused. I can't change the past, but I can change how I do my job moving forward." Mr. Daniels, who was also there, nodded. "That's all we ever wanted, to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." The meeting ended with a promise. The students would keep working with the police to ensure fairness, and the police would continue improving their policies. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a new beginning. Later that evening, the students gathered at the school gym, the same place where they had held the first town meeting. This time, they were celebrating. "We did it," Jake said, looking around. "We actually made a difference." Maria smiled. "But this isn't the end. We have to keep going. Change doesn't happen overnight." Mr. Daniels stepped forward, his voice full of pride. "You all have done something incredible. You proved that young voices matter, that standing up for what's right can lead to real change. I couldn't be prouder." The students cheered. They knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. They had started a movement, and they weren't going to stop now. As they left the gym, Jake looked up at the night sky. "We changed our town," he said. "Maybe one day, we can change even more." Maria nodded. "One step at a time, Jake. One step at a time." And with that, they walked forward, not just as students, but as leaders of a brighter future. The fight for justice never truly ends, but now they knew they had the power to make a difference.